the illusion of the center. For a long time, everyone believed power lived in one place. Decisions flowed outward. Authority radiated from a single point. And as long as that center held, the system felt stable, predictable, and controllable. The logic was elegant in its simplicity. If you knew where decisions were made, you knew how to influence them. Proximity to the center was proximity to power. Distance from it was marginality. The map of influence was, in this sense, also a map of geography. And for a considerable stretch of modern financial history, that map remained remarkably stable. London was built to be that center. Capital passed through it. Rules were written around it. Markets looked to it for signals, direction, and reassurance. Being close to the center meant influence. Being far from it meant delay. Geography still mattered, and the map seemed clear. The city did not merely occupy a position in global finance. It constituted a kind of institutional gravity, pulling transactions, relationships, and standards toward itself in ways that reinforced and legitimized its centrality with every passing cycle. To understand why this illusion mattered, we have to return to a time when concentration equaled control, when fewer participants meant clearer oversight, when complexity was limited enough that authority could realistically sit at the top and cascade downward. London thrived in that world, not just because of money, but because of position. The center was not simply a metaphor. It was a functional description of how information moved, how decisions were validated, and how the system reproduced itself. To be the center was to be the point through which everything meaningful had passed. The early signs of change were easy to miss. Activity increased, but outcomes still appeared centered. Decisions multiplied, but coordination held. It felt like growth, not transformation. The city remained busy, powerful, and confident in its role. The volume rising around the center was interpreted as evidence of the center's vitality, not as an early signal that the architecture sustaining it was beginning to change in ways that would eventually render its traditional function obsolete. Then something subtle began to shift. Influence no longer depended on proximity alone. Outcomes started forming elsewhere before reaching the center at all. By the time signals arrived in London, reactions had already occurred. The center was informed, but no longer decisive. This was the reveal. The center still existed, but its function had changed. It collected information rather than directing it. It explained outcomes rather than shaping them. Power had not vanished, but had begun moving in ways the map no longer captured. London was still at the heart of finance, but the heart was no longer where decisions were born. And once that distinction became clear, the idea of a single center would never feel stable again. As the illusion faded, London's role began shifting in subtle but profound ways. The city still processed vast flows of capital, but it no longer initiated every outcome. Decisions formed across networks, then passed through London as one step among many. Participants noticed a change first. Traders acted on signals that emerged elsewhere. Institutions coordinated across time zones before consulting traditional authorities. Influence arrived pre-assembled, not dictated. The center was still visible, but increasingly reactive. Those operating closest to it began sensing that the confidence it projected was increasingly retrospective, a confident narration of events that had already been decided rather than an active shaping of events still in motion. This altered behavior quietly. Being near the center no longer guaranteed advantage. Speed and connectivity mattered more than proximity. Firms invested in networks, not offices. Relationships began outperforming location. Power followed those who could align quickly, not those closest to established hubs. The practical consequence was a gradual but unmistakable redistribution of operational relevance, away from physical and institutional proximity to the center and toward the capacity to participate in the distributed flows that the center no longer controlled. Tension emerged inside institutions designed for centrality. Committees assumed oversight that no longer fit the system's tempo. By the time guidance arrived, markets had already adjusted. Authority lagged behind action. The institutional structures that had been optimized for a world of centralized decision-making found themselves poorly equipped for a world in which decisions were distributed, asynchronous, and increasingly difficult to trace back to any single originating authority. The danger lay not in loss of relevance, but in misperception. Acting as if the center still controlled outcomes risked destabilizing coordination. Commands issued too late disrupted alignment. Silence created confusion. The system no longer responded predictably to centralized cues. The greater the gap between the center's self-perception and the distributed reality around it, the more likely that gap would produce interference rather than influence whenever the center attempted to assert itself. London faced a difficult realization. Remaining influential required relinquishing the illusion of command. The city could still shape outcomes, but only by adapting to a world where power was already in motion. The center was not collapsing. It was being redefined, and how London responded would determine whether it faded or evolved. The conflict sharpened when London tried to act like the center it used to be. Signals were issued with confidence, but markets no longer waited. Coordination had already occurred elsewhere. Actions taken from the top arrived out of sync, sometimes amplifying instability instead of calming it. Institutions felt the strain internally. Authority structures assumed influence they no longer possessed. Decisions designed to guide instead collided with movements already underway. The result was friction between intention and outcome, between legacy power and distributed reality. This friction was not merely operational. It was epistemic. Institutions operating on an outdated map of the system's power structure were generating responses calibrated to a reality that no longer existed. And those responses, however well-intentioned, introduced noise into a network that had already organized itself around a different understanding of how coordination happened. Participants grew cautious. They began interpreting central signals not as commands, but as commentary. Guidance was weighed, not followed. The center still spoke, but its voice was now one among many. Control had dissolved into conversation. The breaking moment came when a well-intended intervention disrupted alignment across the network. Markets reacted sharply, not because the action was wrong, but because it arrived too late. The illusion of control had turned influence into interference. London confronted an uncomfortable truth. Power no longer obeyed vertical structures. It flowed horizontally, shaped by timing and trust rather than position. Attempts to reclaim command only revealed how far authority had already shifted. The more forcefully the center asserted itself, the more clearly it demonstrated its own displacement, because force, in a distributed system, confirms that persuasion has failed, and persuasion fails most visibly when the structure depends on no longer exists. This was not decline, but transition. The center could no longer impose order, but it could still shape context. It could convene, coordinate, and interpret. If it stopped pretending command, the city now stood at a crossroads. Cling to a role that no longer fit, or redefine influence for a system that had already moved on. The resolution came when London stopped trying to lead from above and began leading from within. The city accepted that influence in a distributed system does not come from issuing commands, but from shaping the environment where coordination happens. Institutions reoriented toward facilitation. Instead of directing outcomes, they clarified signals. Instead of enforcing alignment, they enabled it. The center became a meeting point, a place where perspectives converged and shared understanding formed. This was a genuinely different kind of power, less dramatic than command, less visible than authority, but in many ways more durable, because it did not depend on the structural conditions that had made command possible in the first place. This shift restored relevance. London regained influence not by controlling movement, but by making movement intelligible. It provided narrative standards and trust that networks could rely on as they moved independently. Power became contextual rather than positional. The city's value was no longer derived from being the place through which everything had to pass. It was derived from being the place that could make sense of everything that was passing, and in making sense of it, give a shared meaning that participants across the network could orient themselves around. The lesson endured quietly. In complex systems, authority cannot dominate flow. It must move with it. The illusion of the center dissolves. But influence remains for those willing to adapt. The transition from command to context is not a loss of power. It is a transformation of it. From the brittle, position-dependent power of the center to the resilient, relationship-dependent power of the node that the network trusts to interpret itself. London did not lose power. It learned how to use it differently. Subscribe to join the journey. The